In this video, I'm going to look at importing rainfall data from Denmark into OpenRoads Designer. So I have the Danish spreadsheet open here, and we can see that if we input the northern and eastern coordinates, the return period, and the climate change factor, then that gives us intensity, duration, and frequency rainfall data. The units for the intensity are micrometers per second, and that's not a unit that we support in the software at the moment. So I've created a second spreadsheet where I've got the durations, the intensity in micrometers per second, and I've then used a formula to convert that intensity into millimeters per hour. So all the formula's doing is taking that rainfall intensity in micrometers per second, multiplying it by 60 to convert to minutes, 60 to convert to hours, and then dividing by 1,000 to convert micrometers to millimeters. So I've got OpenRoads Designer running, and I've selected the subsurface utilities workflow. So from the components ribbon, I can click storm data. Now we can create storm data in lots of different types, but in this particular case, I'm interested in creating a user-defined IDF table. So I'm going to select that and right-click and say New User-Defined IDF Table. Now, before I create the data, I need to set the units for the duration correctly. So they might come in as hours by default, in which case right-click on that column title, go to Units and Formatting, and our durations are in minutes, so select minutes from the list. The next step is to add a return period. We know from our spreadsheet that the return period is 5 years, so we'll type that in. And then we want to add the durations. So I'll click Add Durations, Add Range, and then I'm going to go back to my spreadsheet. I'm going to highlight the range of durations. I'm going to press Ctrl+C. Then I'm going to go back to the dialog and press Ctrl+V. So that pastes in the durations. So I can click OK. And we see the durations listed. Then I'll go back to the spreadsheet again. And this time I'll copy the intensities in millimeters an hour. So Ctrl+C there, come back to the storm data dialog, click in the first cell and Ctrl+V to paste in the intensities. Now it's good practice to make some notes on the source of the rainfall data so that you can check it in the future. So I'm going to go to the Notes tab, and it just gives me an empty box. So I'm going to go back to my rainfall spreadsheet. I'm just going to highlight the cells and press Ctrl+C, and then go back to my notes field and press Ctrl+V to paste those notes in here. So they'll be remembered and they're available for the future. Finally, I'm going to right-click on my new rainfall data, and I'm going to rename that. I'll call it Example Denmark in this case, and 5-year return period, and press return. So that's the rainfall data imported. So I can now close the storm data dialog. But as you saw in that storm data dialog, you can have different formats of rainfall data and as many different sets of rainfall data as you like. So the next step is to specify which set of rainfall data we want to use. So under the storm data icon, we can see the option for global storm events. So if we select that, we can see that here's where we specify the storm data that we're going to use. Now notice the alternative name, Base Rainfall Runoff. I'll come back to that in a second, but the global storm event, we can click in, and then from the drop-down list we can select our storm data that we just created. Now the storm data that we pasted in includes a climate change factor. If we had left the climate change factor at 1 instead of 1.57, we could have applied a climate adjustment type in this dialog. So we could have said we want a constant climate change adjustment, and we could have typed in a factor of 1.57 here instead. We don't need to apply it here because it's in the data that we pasted in, but either workflow would give us the same result. So if I close the Global Storm Events dialog now, and I go to Analysis and Scenarios, if I just double click one of these scenarios, we can see the alternatives and the calculation options that this scenario uses. And here's the rainfall runoff alternative, and we can see that it's using an alternative called base rainfall runoff. So that is where the global storm event setting is being used. So here's where we picked our storm event for the alternative called base rainfall runoff, and this scenario is going to use that rainfall runoff alternative. Looking at the spreadsheet again, we can see that it also has the ability to create a rainfall curve. And we can specify the duration, the time step, and whether the curve is symmetrical, and that will generate this table of time steps and intensities. Now again, the units for the intensity are micrometers per second. So in my spreadsheet, I've created a second tab, and again, I've got the time steps, the intensities in micrometers a second, and then I've used the same formula again to convert those intensities into units of millimeters per hour. So back in OpenRoads Designer, I can go back to the storm data dialog, and this time the rainfall data that we want to import is in time and intensity format. So I'll select that, and again, right click, New Time Intensity. So I can click the New button and choose from several different methods of creating the storm event. In this particular case, I'm going to use the New Return Event option. I'll type in a name. I'll type the return event. The start time will be 0 minutes. The increment is 1 minute, and the end time is 240 minutes. And again, you can right click and specify and change the units and formatting here if you need to. We'll click OK. That builds a table on the top right, and we can see that at the moment all of the intensities are 0. So we can go back to our spreadsheet. We can highlight the cells with our converted intensities. We can select those, Control C, and again back in the dialog I can click in the first cell and press Control V to copy the values in. Now note that when I copied the values from the spreadsheet, I included the cell with an intensity of 0, so that's why I clicked in that top cell there to paste the top or first intensity into the correct row. Now once again I have the Notes tab available, so I can paste in some pertinent details about the storm event. I'm just going to click to highlight that text, and I'm going to rename my time intensity data and press return. So that's that storm event created, and we can see we have a graph down at the bottom showing the variations of intensities with time. So now we can close the storm data dialog. If we go back to the global storm events dialog, we saw earlier that we need to set up a rainfall alternative so that we can pick the global storm event that we want to use. So I need to create a new alternative. So I'll just close that dialog for a moment. I'll go to Analysis and Alternatives. Here's all of the alternatives listed. So I want to create a new rainfall runoff alternative. I'll just paste in that text again. If I can either double click that rainfall runoff alternative and choose the storm event here. There it is there. Or I can go back to the components ribbon, global storm events. That alternative is now listed. And again, I can click the drop down and select the rainfall curve that I've imported there. So either way achieves the same objective. Now the final step with a rainfall curve is to set up a scenario that uses it. So we saw how we can go to Analysis and Scenarios and see all of our scenarios. So we'd need to set up a new scenario to use that rainfall curve. And because that rainfall curve is in time intensity format, we would need to activate a civil storm license to give us the ability to compute a unsteady analysis.